Is ASMR sexual? Well, to answer that question, I would like to ask you 2 questions. The first, do you want it to be? And the second, does it matter? Not many people in my life know that I have this ASMR channel. I was telling a very good friend about it for the first time recently, and then I showed him an example of an ASMR video, not one of my own. And he certainly understood the objective and the appeal of an ASMR video. But he seemed not to be someone who is susceptible to ASMR triggers himself. And the first thing that he said was, "Isn't this a bit sexual?" And I said to him, "I think you are confusing sexual with sensual." And I think for most of us who are susceptible to ASMR triggers, that distinction is quite important, and that for us ASMR is most certainly a sensual experience, but it is not necessarily a sexual experience. Now, I am well aware that there is a subset of ASMR that is deliberately erotic and appeals to that side of the human condition. But the vast majority of ASMR channels and ASMR videos are very much an appeal to the senses. Of course, sexuality and sensuality are not separate things, but they are also not the same thing. They are certainly related, but it's important not to confuse them, I think. We are, most of us, familiar with that sensation of the delightful sort of tingle down the back of the head or through the scalp or somewhere else, wherever it is that we individually experience it. And therefore, the fact that we are sensing that and that we are having a sensation means that ASMR is quite deliberately sensual for us. Now, that's not to say that sexuality and sensuality are separate things. They are, of course, very intimately related, and one does sometimes involve the other, and one can sometimes lead to the other. But for a lot of us, particularly in Western cultures, we have our grounding in Victorian prudish sort of views and in puritanical approaches, particularly in certain parts of the world, and we have it somewhat ingrained into us that anything that is overtly sensual might lead to something that is sexual, and we tend to be very uncomfortable about that concept, and we need to close the door on anything that seems like it might go down that direction. Now, the open question here is, if ASMR is a sexual experience for some people, is that a bad thing? Well, I can only leave that up to you to decide. Certainly most of the ASMR that you will see online is not intended to be sexual. It is intended to get people into certain kinds of states. So ASMR for most people induces in them a state of relaxation or a state of calm. It can induce a state of meditation, Zen, a philosophical mindset they might come into when they are listening or watching an ASMR video. They might even slip into a really pleasant alpha brainwave state. All of those states are very constructive, and they are all very positive. One thing I really love about ASMR and the effect that it has on us is that it encourages a positive mindset about feeling pleasure through your senses, and specifically the auditory sense, sometimes the visual sense, and sometimes even the tactile sense if you're getting a tingle, a physical tingle in your body. There are not actually that many avenues in our life where we are able to feel this beautiful a combination of pleasures all in one go without it being in some way unacceptable. And I think it can only be a good thing if we are allowing ourselves to get into a relaxed state where we are simply calm and feeling pleasure and feeling relaxed, maybe even escaping from our lives for a little while, in a way that is aimed to be positive and uncomplicated. Personally, I don't believe the pursuit of pleasure to be a bad thing in any way, as long as nobody's getting hurt. And I don't believe it indulgent to seek relaxation. For many people, ASMR is a kind of therapy, and all of those mental states that I mentioned earlier can be extremely helpful for people during difficult times. The world can be a really awful place sometimes, and even those of us living in developed nations that are economically stable will be feeling our own versions of sadness and anxiety, pain, displeasure, disappointment, fear, grief. And how can it be a bad thing to seek a way out of that, however that may be, or a way to help us to mitigate those feelings and get back onto an even keel, and maybe even put us into a place where we can treat others more respectably because we feel better ourselves. Many of us first experienced ASMR in a completely non-sexual circumstance and continue to, and maybe will only ever experience ASMR outside of sexual encounters, and perhaps would never even consider the two things to be ever overlapping. For many people, I think there is no Venn diagram of sexual encounters and ASMR type of mental states. So I want to now talk about my history of ASMR and experience of ASMR. I'm going to tell you about the first few times it happened to me, and I'm going to tell you about my specific preferred triggers, and I'm also going to tell you about who my favorite ASMR artists are currently. So, my earliest memories of experiencing ASMR are at school. For me, the human voice is a very powerful thing, and I do distinctly remember sometimes sitting in class, maybe being a little bit bored, listening to a teacher speak, and if that teacher had just the right combination of qualities to their voice and their cadence and their volume and their speed, then I would find myself drifting into an ASMR state, getting that really lovely tingle down the back of my head and really dropping down into a very calm, almost meditative state where I was receiving some of what they said, probably just by osmosis because I wasn't actively concentrating, because I was so very relaxed and calm. And actually it's quite possible that I learned those lessons in those classes better because I was in a Zen-like ASMR state at the time. Some people talk about first experiencing ASMR as well when you do things as a child like tickle each other's backs and tickle each other's scalps. I sometimes think that perhaps that's not really ASMR because that actually is literally being touched. That is sensing human touch, whereas I think the defining feature of ASMR is that it is a touch-like experience without actually being touched. So for me, ASMR has always been very much an experience that is tied to oral, A-U-R-A-L, stimuli generally. Or you could also say that it's oral in that the human voice is involved in creating that ASMR state. And I don't tend to tie it to touch per se. I do think of ASMR as a sensation that occurs specifically without touch. But it's not the same for everyone, And we all experience our senses differently. There is such a thing as synesthesia, in which people can have sort of crossed wires when it comes to their senses, and say will smell something that will actually give them a vision, or they will feel a touch on their skin that will cause them to hear music or hear sounds. And I actually think that maybe for all of us, our senses occur to us differently. But within ASMR, I think that we have discovered just how very much all of us have in common, and at the same time, how very much we are all just ever so slightly different. And isn't that an absolutely wonderful thing to think about? So, when it comes to specifically how I am different, I'm going to tell you about what are my chief triggers. Now, I really hope that I don't offend or upset anyone. I want to reiterate that we are all different, and there is a whole world of ASMR triggers out there, and what triggers one person will not trigger everybody, and it's not for us to judge. So, for me, the chiefest and most consistent trigger is, in fact, the soft-spoken voice. It is different, I think, than whispering, and I think that they are quite different triggers, though they do sometimes overlap. And of course, given the possibilities of the human voice, it is possible to speak somewhere between a soft speaking and a whisper. So it's not so cut and dried as we might think. So soft speaking is definitely my chiefest trigger by quite a wide margin, but it is also possible for me to be triggered by some other things. Sometimes tapping, only certain kinds of tapping, and a certain pace and a certain volume, but tapping is not sort of a reliable trigger for me. Sometimes crinkling bags, also an unreliable trigger, and it depends on, again, how loud it is, how fast it's being done, what sort of intensity, what kind of plastic the bag that's being crinkled is. I can also be triggered by some visual stimuli, particularly hand movements that are very graceful, and things like turning pages. One thing I am not triggered by is whispering, which is strange because I am triggered by mouth sounds sometimes, to a certain extent. Not really the sort of deliberate, exaggerated mouth sounds or the videos that are purely about mouth sounds, but I certainly do enjoy when someone has some really delightfully fruity mouth sounds going on when they talk, and even if they are doing it deliberately but it's not extremely exaggerated, that can be really fun. And I know that that is a very sort of controversial trigger because some people absolutely hate it. And I think that there are actually kind of two types of people in this world. There's those who are okay with the sound of other people eating, and there are those who are not. And I think that the people who really don't notice the sounds of other people eating are those people who also enjoy mouth sounds in their ASMR. And then the other people just really don't like the sounds of mouths doing those funny wet sounds that mouths can make, and all the apparatus inside the mouth can make when it's doing all the funny and wonderful things that the mouth does. I have no judgment on whether people like this or don't. I just know what I like. So when it comes to favourite ASMR artists, you will not be surprised to find that my chiefest ones are soft speakers. So the very first ASMR video I remember ever seeing was, of course, like many of us, Maria Gentle Whispering. I came to YouTube one day and her haircut role play from about 3 years ago had made its way to the front page. And I was very curious about this, so I clicked on it, and I immediately understood what this video was trying to do and what Maria was trying to do, and probably because I immediately experienced an ASMR response, and really that just opened up the whole world of ASMR to me. I think I then went and watched a number of her videos, and I understood that this is a thing, and that, oh my god, this is a thing that other people experience just as I do. And isn't it wonderful to think back on that moment when you discovered ASMR and that you suddenly realized that hundreds of thousands of millions of people in the world feel exactly as you do, and you may never have ever explained to someone that this is something that you experience. And millions of us have never explained to anyone that this is something that we experience, and then all of a sudden millions of us are able to acknowledge it and to talk about it just as normally as we might talk about how relaxed we feel when we have a massage. So I was very happy to find Maria, and will always be grateful to her for opening up that world to me and to so many of us. And she remains, to this day, probably my favourite ASMR artist, and certainly the most consistently triggering artist for me, probably because her videos are very consistent in quality and style, and her tone of voice is very carefully performed, and so she seems to understand what it is that people are getting from her, and she goes to a lot of trouble to make sure that she delivers that to them. Other soft speakers that I have enjoyed are the one Lilium, Whispers Red, Emma from Whispers Red, the Water Whispers, of course, Ilsa, Olivia's Kisper ASMR, Amal from Amal ZD, the French Whisperer. I don't listen to that many male ASMR artists, and I will confess it's because sometimes it does feel a little intimate having a soft, low male voice in my ear, but then sometimes it's totally fine. I think it just depends on the individual voice, the way that they deliver it, and the way that you receive it at the time. I know that, as I said before, most ASMR is not intended to be sexual. It is really up to us, though, how we choose to receive it. And I can really enjoy the male voice just as much as the female voice for relaxation. Now, at this point, you may have in mind some of the other really big, well-known ASMR artists, and you're wondering why I haven't mentioned them. Well, I may be aware of them, but a lot of the really big ASMR artists are chiefly whisperers. And as I said, I don't really get triggered by whispering. For me, it's quite distinct from soft speaking. And some of those really huge, very popular ASMR artists, if all they do generally is whisper, I'm probably not going to be watching a lot of their videos. I may well be subscribed, though, because there is so much else to be entertained by those particular ASMR artists. That being said, your idea of the great and wonderful ASMR artists out there will be different from mine, and what I would really love is if you told me in the comments your favourite ASMR artists, and you can even tell me why, if you like. Don't hesitate if they are very famous, well-known ones. Please even mention those, because we all have different little trails across YouTube, and we may not actually have found those particular ASMR artists yet. It is a big world out there, and I'm always looking for new recommendations. It is, of course, possible to lose your ASMR sensitivity, and it is possible to lose it on a particular artist. And so sometimes it's good to find someone new to change up your perspective a bit, and maybe to recalibrate your sensory perception so that you can go back to your old favorites and love them just as you once did. So please do give me some recommendations, even if they are whisperers. I don't mind. Sometimes, you can find yourself surprised by an ASMR trigger, and I think that is one of the best things about ASMR. It is such a big, interesting, untapped, mysterious world that we have only just begun to explore, and every time you click on a new video, you may be exposed to a new trigger and find that there is something else that you like that you didn't know that you liked, or that you didn't know would trigger you, or you didn't know would make you feel very relaxed. So in that sense, the exploration of ASMR is so exciting. So that's probably all I have to say on the topic of ASMR for today. Please, as I said, do share with me in the comments your favourite ASMR artists, maybe even tell me why. Or you could even paste a link to your favourite specific videos. I'm always so interested in what it is that other people like in the ASMR community, and so I would be most fascinated to see what it is that my viewers in particular like to see. If you have any thoughts on the sexuality versus sensuality and ASMR as an erotic art form subject, please also discuss those in the comments. I think it is a fascinating subject area to explore. I would just encourage you all to be very respectful of one another and respectful of me as I endeavour to be respectful of you. I know that this is not something I generally have to worry about with you guys because we are such a positive and welcoming community, but I just thought it might be constructive to say that now. In any case, I hope that you have enjoyed this video and gotten some food for thought and maybe some inspiration. And as I said, please share with me anything that you need to say in the comments. I'm looking so forward to interacting with you on these particular subjects. So, thank you, and I will see you next time.